What smart minds do when facing foolish people. Schopenhauer philosophy. You already know something is wrong with them. You sensed it before you could name it. The conversation ends, and you walk away feeling lighter. Not because it went well, but because you survived it. You were not talking to a person in the full sense of the word. You were talking to a reflex, a pattern, a biological machine that produces opinions, the way a factory produces identical units, automatically, without inspection, without variance, without a single moment of genuine thought. And the worst part? They will never know this about themselves. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes only from intelligent people who have spent too long in the company of foolish ones. It is not physical, it is not even emotional in the traditional sense. It is something closer to a friction, a grinding of gears that were never designed to mesh you. Try to explain something real, something complex, something that required you years of reading, suffering, and brutal self-examination to understand, and they respond quickly, confidently, with the tone of someone who has never once questioned whether their confidence is earned. This is not about education. It is not about IQ scores or academic credentials, or how many books a person has read. There are credentialed fools. There are university-trained idiots who can construct elaborate arguments for profoundly stupid positions. The foolishness Schopenhauer was dissecting is something older and more fundamental. It is the refusal, sometimes conscious, usually not to allow reality to disturb the comfort of one's existing conclusions. Most people live inside a sealed room. They have furnished it carefully. Every belief, every assumption, every conviction is arranged precisely where they want it. And then you arrive, not as an attack, simply as someone carrying a piece of information that does not fit inside their room. And they look at you, not with curiosity, but with the instinctive hostility of someone whose interior decoration has just been threatened. You are not dealing with an argument. You are dealing with an identity. And somewhere in the back of your mind, without quite knowing why, already understand this conversation will not end the way rational conversations are supposed to end. That feeling is not arrogance, it is pattern recognition. And it is the beginning of something Schopenhauer understood with brutal clarity. Most people, when they encounter someone they would charitably describe as difficult or closed-minded or not very self-aware, reach for the same comfortable conclusion: education is the answer. Information is the answer. If you just explained it more clearly, more patiently, with better examples, with more compassion, eventually they will come around. Eventually the light will penetrate. This is the dominant cultural narrative. It sits at the foundation of liberal humanism, enlightenment, philosophy, democratic theory, the idea that human beings are fundamental, rational creatures who, when presented with sufficient evidence and sound reasoning, will update their beliefs accordingly, that the marketplace of ideas is a place where truth wins not because it is powerful, but because it is true. This belief is extraordinarily appealing. It is also almost entirely wrong. You carry this belief because it is the optimistic story. It means that conflict is accidental, that misunderstanding is the cause of most human suffering, that if you were just smart enough, articulate enough, patient enough, you could bring anyone to reason. It means you are never truly incompatible with anyone. It means no one is truly beneath your intellectual reach. Every fool is merely an educated person who hasn't been educated yet. This is a comforting story. It places you in the role of the patient teacher. It transforms frustrating interactions into noble challenges. It gives you something to do, something to attempt, something to hope for, and it keeps you trapped in conversations that will destroy your energy, your clarity, and eventually your will to think at all. The educated person who clings to this belief will spend years, sometimes decades, attempting to reason with people who have no interest in being reasoned with. They will explain and re-explain and find new angles of explanation. They will become more articulate. They will become more patient. They will carry the invisible weight of failed conversions, like unpaid debts, and they will blame themselves. Because if information is the answer, and if information has failed, then the failure must belong to the person delivering the information, not the person refusing it. But that is not what is actually happening. What is actually happening is this: the mind does not operate as a truth-processing machine. It never has. What it operates as what it was designed by evolution to operate, as is a threat detection, an identity preservation machine. The brain's primary function is not to locate truth. It is to protect the organism, and for most of human history, the organism's survival depended not on being right, but on remaining coherent, internally, consistent, socially aligned, tribally legible. Cognitive dissonance, the discomfort experienced when new information conflicts with existing belief, is not a glitch, it is a feature. The discomfort is designed to motivate rejection of the intrusive information, not incorporation of it. The mind, when confronted with a fact that contradicts its framework, does not automatically update the framework. It attacks the fact, it questions the source, it reframes the argument, it accuses you of bad faith. It does anything and everything except the one thing it appears to be doing: engaging honestly. Leon Festinger documented this mechanically in the 1950s. He studied a doomsday cult whose prophecy failed. The world did not end on the predicted date, and the believers did not leave the cult. They did not reconsider their assumptions. They became more committed. They explained the failure away as a divine reprieve caused by their own righteousness. The prophecy's failure became, through cognitive alchemy, proof of the prophecy's validity. This is not stupidity in any simple sense. This is the mind doing exactly what the mind does. Schopenhauer, who understood human psychology with a cold precision that most psychologists would only achieve posthumously, wrote that the will precedes the intellect. He did not mean willpower in the motivational sense. He meant something darker and more structural. He meant that what a person wants to believe, what they need to believe in order to remain who they are, determines what their intellect will be deployed to prove the reasoning is real. The logic is real, but it is in service of a conclusion that was reached before the first premise was examined. The intellect in Schopenhauer's architecture is the servant. The will is the master, and the will wants what it has always wanted: survival, consistency, the preservation of the self-image. This is why argument fails. Not because your argument is weak, because argument is the wrong instrument. You are attempting surgery with a blunt hammer on a patient who does not believe they are ill. Carl Jung approached the same territory from a different angle. He observed that people do not see the world as it is. They project their own psychological content outward, and then respond to the projection. The fool is not engaging with your argument. They are engaging with the character. They have already decided. You are the interpretation arrived before you. Opened your mouth. And the mechanism that locks this in place is something Jung called the persona, the constructed identity a person presents to and believes about themselves. To question a person's belief is not perceived as an intellectual challenge. It is perceived as an assassination, attempt on their persona. You are not in a debate. You are in a territorial dispute, and territory is not surrendered. Through argument, territory is surrendered only through force or exhaustion, or the slow erosion of time, never through reason alone. This is the uncomfortable truth that most people will never fully integrate. History provides no shortage of evidence, but the evidence most people find most comfortable to examine is always at a safe historical distance. The atrocities of other centuries, the madness of other cultures, the foolishness of other eras, this is itself a defense mechanism. By placing the evidence far enough away, avoid the confrontation with what it reveals about the architecture of your own mind. Consider the case of Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working in Vienna in the 1840s. Semmelweis noticed that mortality rates in maternity wards attended by medical students were dramatically higher than wards attended by midwives. He traced the cause. The medical students were moving directly from cadaver dissections to childbirth deliveries without washing their hands. He introduced mandatory hand washing with chlorinated lime solution, mortality, RATES, collapsed. The evidence was overwhelming, reproducible, and statistically unambiguous. The medical establishment rejected him, attacked him, had him institutionalized. He died in a psychiatric hospital at 57, likely beaten by the guards, which is to say, the man who discovered the mechanism by which doctors were killing their own patients was destroyed by the very institution. It should have celebrated him, not because his data was wrong, because his data was correct. It implied that respectable, educated, credentialed physicians had been causing the deaths of thousands of women, and the will to preserve the self-image of the medical establishment was infinitely stronger than the will to process an uncomfortable fact. The mechanism is identical in smaller daily interactions. The scale differs. The architecture does not. Observe any ordinary workplace. The manager who has made a catastrophic decision, not once but consistently, will rarely acknowledge the pattern. They will explain each individual failure with a separate context. Specific excuse they will find. External causes they will locate. Blame with precision. Everywhere except the source. The people around them who see the pattern clearly will gradually learn to say nothing, because to name the pattern is to activate the defense mechanism. And once the defense mechanism is active, the conversation does not produce understanding. It produces entrenchment. This is not pathology in the clinical sense. This is the human norm. The pathology is actually on the other side. The people who update their beliefs rapidly and completely in response to evidence, who revise their self-image without resistance, who do not flinch at information that implicates them. These people are extraordinarily rare. They are psychologically unusual. Schopenhauer would say they have, through some combination of suffering and discipline, partially disentangled their intellect from the tyranny of the will. Most people will never achieve this. Most people will die inside the same sealed room they constructed in adolescence, having merely rearranged the furniture several times and called it growth. The evidence is not difficult to find. The difficulty is in not flinching when you find it pointing at you. Here is the part you have been waiting for, without knowing it. Here is the moment where the lens turns. You have been reading this as an analysis of other people, of the fool across the table, of the colleague who cannot be reasoned with, of the relative at the dinner table who has heard no argument, capable of penetrating their certainty. You have been nodding along, with the comfortable assumption that the subject under examination is someone else. But the mechanism does not discriminate. Your brain is also a will-preserving machine. Your intellect is also at least partially in service of conclusions you reached before you examined them. You also have a sealed room. You also have arrangements. You will defend with the full force of your reasoning capacity, arrangements that you call my values, understanding my carefully considered positions that are in more cases than you want to acknowledge simply the furniture you chose when you were young and frightened and needed the room to feel safe. Jung called this the shadow, the collection of everything you have decided you are not, cannot be, would not recognize in yourself. The shadow is not the absence of intelligence. The shadow of an intelligent person is more dangerous than the shadow of a fool, because it is better disguised. An intelligent person's self-deceptions are more elaborate, more internally consistent, more impervious to external challenge. They have constructed better arguments for their worst tendencies. They have given their avoidances philosophical justification. They have turned their limitations into aesthetic choices. You may have dismissed people as foolish when the real dynamic was simpler and more uncomfortable. They were threatening something you needed to be true. You may have decided someone was not worth engaging with. The truth is that their argument was worth engaging with, and you preferred not to. You may have cultivated a private identity as one of the clear-eyed ones, the person who sees through illusion, who operates without the comfortable numbness of ordinary self-deception, while that identity itself functions as the most sophisticated self-deception of all, because the person who is certain they are not subject to the mechanisms being described is the person most thoroughly subject to them. This is the Jungian trap. The shadow grows strongest precisely where you are most confident, It does not exist. The genuine movement of intelligence, not the performance of it, but the actual thing, involves a willingness to locate the fool within the self, not as a ritual self-flagellation, not as false modesty, as a precision instrument. You must be able to see clearly where your reasoning becomes motivated. Patience ends not because the conversation ended, because the conversation became dangerous to your self-image, where your contempt for another person's closed-mindedness functions as a mirror you are holding in the wrong direction. Schopenhauer was one of the most clear-eyed diagnosticians of human foolishness in intellectual history. He was also, by most accounts, profoundly difficult, frequently contemptuous, and isolated by his own inability to tolerate the friction of other minds. He could describe the mechanism with extraordinary precision. He could not always escape it. This is not a contradiction. This is the territory. Wisdom is not immunity. It is the practice of noticing faster, more honestly, with less latency, the moment the mechanism begins to operate in you. Most people will never do this consistently. Most people will never even attempt it. Now consider, who benefits from the mechanism remaining invisible? Every system of social control, political, religious, corporate, familial, depends on the will-preserving function of the arrangements that you call my values, my understanding, my carefully considered positions that are in more cases than you want to acknowledge, simply the furniture you chose when you were young and frightened and needed the room to feel safe. Jung called this the shadow, the collection of everything you have decided you are not, cannot be, would not recognize in yourself. The shadow is not the absence of intelligence. The shadow of an intelligent person is more dangerous than the shadow of a fool, because it is better disguised in intelligent persons. Self-deceptions are more elaborate, more internally consistent, more impervious to external challenge. They have constructed better arguments for their worst tendencies. They have given their avoidances philosophical justification. They have turned their limitations into aesthetic choices. You may have dismissed people as foolish when the real dynamic was simpler and more uncomfortable. They were threatening something you needed to be true. You may have decided someone was not worth engaging with, when the truth is that their argument was worth engaging with, and you preferred not to. You may have cultivated a private identity as one of the clear-eyed ones, the person who sees through illusion, who operates without the comfortable numbness of ordinary self-deception, while that identity itself functions as the most sophisticated self-deception of all, because the person who is certain they are not subject to the mechanisms being described is the person most thoroughly subject to them. This is the Jungian trap. The shadow grows strongest precisely where you are most confident it does not exist. The genuine movement of intelligence, not the performance of it, but the actual thing, involves a willingness to locate the fool within the self, not as a ritual self-flagellation, not as false modesty, as a precision instrument. You must be able to see clearly where your reasoning becomes motivated, where your patience ends, not because the conversation ended, because the conversation became dangerous to your self-image, where your contempt for another person's close-mindedness functions as a mirror you are holding in the wrong direction. Schopenhauer was one of the most clear-eyed diagnosticians of human foolishness in intellectual history. He was also, by most accounts, profoundly difficult, frequently contemptuous and isolated by his own inability to tolerate the friction of other minds. He could describe the mechanism with extraordinary precision. He could not always escape it. This is not a contradiction. This is the territory. Wisdom is not immunity. It is the practice of noticing faster, more honestly, with less latency. The moment the mechanism begins to operate in you, most people will never do this consistently. Most people will never even attempt it. Now, consider who benefits from the mechanism remaining invisible. Every system of social control, political, religious, corporate, familial, depends on the will-preserving function of the. Schopenhauer was clear on this. He did not spend his later years developing better persuasion methods. He spent them in radical strategic withdrawal from conversations that had no capacity for resolution. This is the first and most fundamental movement of the genuinely clear-eyed mind, the accurate assessment of whether a given conversation has a structure that permits genuine exchange, or whether it is a performance, an interaction in which both parties are defending positions. Rather than examining reality, most conversations are performances, most arguments are territorial displays. The person who understands this does not attempt to win them. They exit them fully, without residual guilt, without the nagging conviction that they should have tried harder or explained more clearly. This is not coldness, it is precision. You do not attempt surgery in a room where surgery is impossible. You do not plant seeds in concrete. The energy expenditure is not the noble thing. It appears to be from the inside. It is waste. The second movement is more subtle and more difficult. The cultivation of what Schopenhauer called intellectual self-sufficiency. The mind that is genuinely free of the worst effects of this mechanism is the mind that does not require external validation of its conclusions, that does not need the fool to acknowledge the truth of what is being said, that can hold a position clearly without the approval of the room, without the discomfort of social disapproval, triggering a retreat into safer territory. This is rare. Most people, including people who believe themselves intellectually independent, are more socially calibrated than they realize. The opinion of the room affects their thinking more than they acknowledge. The discomfort of being wrong in public is so aversive that it motivates preemptive self-censorship. You do not say the thing that will generate hostility. You soften it. You qualify it. You eventually stop saying it at all. And then you stop thinking it. The mechanism operates, and the capitulation is so gradual, it never registers as capitulation. The third movement, and the one most people will never arrive at, is the capacity to simultaneously recognize foolishness in another person and remain genuinely curious about what the foolishness reveals, not about the person, about the mechanism, about the structure. Every interaction with a mind operating in full service of its own will is a case study, an illustration, a demonstration of the architecture in live motion. The person who can observe this without contempt, without frustration, without the need to correct it, and instead use the observation as a kind of data, has achieved something that is in framework, close to the philosophical ideal. Most people will never reach this. Most people will never attempt it, with the consistency required for it, actually alter behavior, rather than merely alter self-description. That is not a consolation. That is simply the reality of the distribution. What Schopenhauer gives you, if you take him seriously, not as a philosopher to quote, but as a diagnostician to apply, is not comfort. He offers no resolution to the fundamental asymmetry between the clear-eyed mind and the mind that has not yet undergone the painful process of examining its own machinery. He does not promise that clarity will make other people more tolerable. He does not promise that understanding the mechanism will protect you from its effects. What he offers is something colder and more valuable, an accurate map. And an accurate map of terrible terrain is infinitely more useful than a beautiful map of terrain that does not exist. You live in a world populated overwhelmingly by minds that are not primarily oriented toward truth, that are structured at the level of their deepest drives to protect the coherence of the self at any cost, including the cost of reality, that will use every available cognitive resource to avoid seeing what they do not want to see, that will experience your clearest insights, not as gifts, but as threats. This is not a tragedy, it is a condition. It is the condition of human existence, documented across every culture, every era, every philosophical tradition, that was honest enough to look at the evidence without flinching. Looked Jung, looked Nietzsche, looked. They did not comfort themselves. They mapped the question that remains, the question that this analysis deposits in you, if you have followed it honestly, is not, what do I do with foolish people? That question has been answered. You see them clearly. You exit unprofitable engagements. You maintain your intellectual coherence without requiring their agreement. You observe the mechanism in motion with curiosity rather than contempt. The real question, the question that matters, is what you do with the fool you have located within yourself, because the map is accurate, and the map includes you. And the most dangerous form of the mechanism is the one operating in the mind that has read all the right books, understood all the right frameworks, can describe the psychology of self-deception with precision and fluency, and has used that very understanding as the final, most sophisticated layer of insulation against the truth. The mind that knows about the sealed room is still capable of living inside one. The difference between wisdom and the performance of wisdom is the willingness to remain genuinely uncertain about which one you are doing, and that specific discomfort is a feeling most people will spend their entire lives engineering themselves not to feel. And once you understand this, something changes. You stop trying to rescue every mind trapped inside its own defenses. You stop mistaking resistance for depth, noise for intelligence, confidence for truth. You begin conserving your energy for what is real, for conversations that sharpen awareness instead of suffocating it. But the final lesson is heavier than all the others, because the same machinery you learn to recognize in others exists inside you. The ego hides the mind at its reality. The self protects its illusions with terrifying skill. And the more intelligent a person becomes, the more sophisticated the illusion can appear. So the task is not to become someone who never falls into self-deception. The task is to become someone willing to notice when it happens, to question yourself before questioning the world, to remain capable of doubt even when certainty feels safer. That is rare, that is painful, and that is the beginning of wisdom. If this made you think differently about human nature and yourself, like, share, and subscribe for more deep psychological and philosophical insights.